The city is alive. It smells of river mud and fresh bread and animal dung baking in August sun. The noise hits you first. Iron cartwheels grinding on stone, a blacksmith's hammer ringing 2 streets over, 1,000 voices bargaining in French and English and Flemish and Italian all at once. You are standing at the south gate of London Bridge in the year 1300, and the city ahead of you is the greatest in England by a distance so vast it is almost embarrassing. 100,000 people live within and around these ancient Roman walls. The next largest English city, York, holds perhaps 30,000. Norwich, 20,000. London is not merely the capital. London is England, compressed into a single, extraordinary, suffocating, miraculous square mile. Now hold that image, because within 50 years, half of those people will be dead. There is a man threading through the bridge crowd this August morning. His name is William Harpur, and the court records of the city of London mention him 3 times between 1298 and 1312 as a prosperous woolmonger trading from a stall near the Cheapside market. We cannot know his face. We cannot know whether he was tall or short, cautious or reckless. But we can know his world with extraordinary precision, because medieval London left behind a record, in chronicles, in guild regulations, in court rolls, in the physical evidence that archaeologists have spent 2 centuries excavating. William's world was not primitive. It was not crude. It was a fully realized civilization, humming with commerce and faith and ambition, and it had absolutely no idea that it was living on borrowed time. Step off the bridge and into Cheapside, the main commercial artery of the city, and the sheer density of human activity becomes almost overwhelming. The street is barely 15 feet wide at its broadest point. Above your head, the upper floors of timber-framed houses jut outward on wooden beams called jetties, each successive story leaning a little further over the street than the one below, so that at roof level the buildings on opposite sides nearly touch. On a gray day, which in England is most days, Cheapside at its narrowest feels more like a corridor than a street. On a market day, and every day is a market day on Cheapside, it is a corridor stuffed with bodies. The stalls are organized by trade in a system so orderly it has its own geography. Bread Street runs north off Cheapside, and the air around it carries the yeast-warm smell of the city's professional bakers, who by law must bake a certain number of loaves for the poor when grain prices rise. Milk Street is where cows are led each morning to be milked in the street, because bringing the cow to the customer guarantees the milk is fresh. The Poultry District, just east of Cheapside, specializes in exactly what the name suggests. The Shambles at Smithfield, a short walk northwest, is the city's great butchery district, and the cobblestones there run dark on slaughter days. William Harpur would have known all of this the way a person knows their own home. He would have known which stalls were worth visiting before dawn and which were best after noon when the serious merchants arrived. He would have known the exchange rate between English silver pennies, Venetian ducats, and Florentine florins, because London's commercial life was thoroughly international by 1300. Merchant ships from Venice, Genoa, the Hanseatic League ports of Hamburg and Lübeck, and the great Flemish wool towns of Bruges and Ghent crowded the wharves along the Thames. England's primary export was raw wool. The long, lustrous fleece of the English sheep was the finest in Europe, and men like William Harpur stood at the center of that trade, buying from country producers and selling to foreign merchants who would carry the wool to the great continental looms. The money this generated was staggering. By 1300, London's merchant class had accumulated enough wealth to make kings dependent on their loans. Edward I had borrowed heavily from Italian banking houses to fund his wars in Scotland and Wales. His son, Edward II, would borrow from London's own guilds. The city's mayor and aldermen, who met in the newly built Guildhall just north of Cheapside, wielded a form of political power that no other city in England could approach. When Edward II attempted to impose taxes London found unreasonable, the city's merchants helped organize his overthrow in 1327. This was not merely a commercial city, it was a city that understood its own power. At the highest point of this city stood Old St. Paul's Cathedral, and it was unlike anything you would expect if your only reference is the magnificent domed building that stands on Ludgate Hill today. The medieval St. Paul's was a Gothic monster of extraordinary ambition. It was 586 feet long, slightly longer than two modern football pitches laid end to end. Its spire, completed in 1314 after more than 2 centuries of construction, rose 489 feet into the London sky, making it, at that moment, one of the tallest structures in the world. When you stood at the south end of the city near the river and looked north, the spire dominated the horizon in a way that no single structure dominates a modern city skyline. Inside, the nave was so enormous that Londoners had given it its own name, Paul's Walk, and they used it accordingly. The church had long since given up trying to keep commerce out of its sacred spaces. Merchants conducted deals under the great Gothic arches, lawyers met clients between the pillars, servants gathered near the font looking for work. The boundary between the sacred and the commercial, that we might assume existed in a medieval Christian city, had, in practice, dissolved entirely in London's great cathedral. Religion and trade were not opposites in 1300. They were simply two aspects of the same daily life. William Harper attended Mass at his parish church on Sunday mornings. The city had more than 100 parish churches within the walls, roughly one for every 1,000 inhabitants. He prayed at the church of St. Mary Le Bow, whose bells, ringing every evening across the city, defined the boundary of Cheapside in the ears of every true Londoner. He gave a small charitable donation to the Franciscan friary at Greyfriars each Christmas, as the guild rolls suggest prosperous merchants did. He knew the city's rhythms as intimately as a farmer knows the seasons, and in the autumn of 1314, as the new spire of St. Paul's finally reached its full height, and the city buzzed with a pride that had been building for 2 centuries, he had no reason to imagine that the world he had built his life inside was about to crack. In the spring of 1315, it began to rain. This statement sounds unremarkable for England, where rain is the default state of the atmosphere for roughly 9 months of the year. But what fell from the sky that spring was different in both quantity and persistence from anything living memory held. The rain began in April and did not meaningfully stop until the following summer, and then resumed, and then continued through a third year of almost unbroken precipitation. The Chronicle of Lanercost, written by a monk in northern England who was living through these events, recorded that the rain was so constant and so heavy that contemporaries compared it to the flood described in the book of Genesis. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was the closest framework available to people who had no meteorological vocabulary for what they were witnessing, which was one of the most severe climate disruptions to strike northern Europe in recorded history. The consequences moved through the agricultural system with the terrible logic of a chain whose links are iron. Grain could not ripen in waterlogged fields. Hay for livestock could not be dried. The ground became so saturated that horses and oxen could not pull plows through it without the animals sinking to their hocks. In the lowlands of Yorkshire and the fens of Lincolnshire, rivers burst their banks and remained burst for weeks at a time, drowning fields that had fed the same villages for centuries. Farmers who in a good year could expect to harvest 7 grains for every one planted reported yields of 1 for 2 in 1315. They would have been better off eating the seed grain than planting it. The price mechanism that London's merchants knew so intimately began to behave in ways that felt less like economics and more like punishment. The price of a quarter of wheat, roughly 290 kilograms, enough to feed a family for several months, stood at 5 shillings in the summer of 1314. By June of 1316, it had reached 40 shillings. The price had risen 8-fold in less than 2 years. In a city where the poorest 60% of the population spent more than 3/4 of their income on bread alone, this was not an inconvenience. It was a sentence. William Harper, with his established trade connections and his accumulated capital, could weather a price shock that would destroy his neighbors. He had liquidity. He had credit. He had relationships with suppliers that predated the crisis. But the men and women who worked for day wages, the porters at Billingsgate, the washerwomen of Southwark, the apprentices sleeping in garrets above Cheapside workshops, had none of those resources. They spent everything they earned. When bread cost 8 times what it had cost the year before, they ate less. When they ate less, they weakened. When they weakened, they fell ill. And the city's charitable institutions, the monasteries and hospital foundations that had functioned as London's welfare system for 2 centuries, could not absorb a crisis at this scale. The Chronicle of Robert of Avesbury, a document that survives in the collections of the British Library, records that during the worst of the famine years, bodies were found in London streets in the mornings, men and women who had simply sat down the night before and not risen. Contemporary accounts from Bristol describe conditions so extreme that the chronicler did not have words for them without reaching for biblical comparison. These accounts must be read carefully. Medieval chronicles sometimes amplified suffering for theological effect, but the archaeological record confirms that the period between 1315 and 1322 was marked by a measurable increase in burial rates across English cities. People died, many of them, and then, as the rains finally eased and the harvests slowly returned to something approaching normal between 1317 and 1322, London began to breathe again. William Harpur appears in the London Guild records for the last time in 1319, still trading, still paying his guild dues. Whatever the famine had cost him personally, he survived it. The city survived it. The market stalls on Cheapside reopened. The wool ships returned to the Thames. The cathedral at St. Paul's continued to host its daily congregation of merchants and worshippers and loitering apprentices. By 1325, London's food supply had stabilized. By 1330, the city was growing again. The catastrophe of 1315 began to pass from living memory into story, from trauma into history. And in a warm June morning in 1348, a ship docked at the port of Melcombe Regis on the Dorset coast. The vessel had come from Gascony, in southwestern France. Among its cargo and crew were infected black rats, carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis in their blood. The fleas that fed on those rats were already carrying the bacterium in their gut. When the rats began to die, which infected rats do, rapidly, their fleas looked for new hosts. They found them. The disease that would eventually be called the Black Death had arrived in England. It would not leave quickly. The pathogen moved northward through southern England through the summer and early autumn of 1348, traveling along the same road network and trade routes that had made London wealthy. By late October, it had reached the city. London was not the London of 1300 anymore. The famine had taken perhaps 15% of the population in the worst years, and full recovery had been slow. The city of 1348 held perhaps 70,000 people, not 100,000. It was still the largest city in England by a wide margin. It was still the commercial heart of the kingdom, but it had already been weakened once, and the defenses that a population builds against disease, nutrition, density management, robust immune function in children who have grown up well-fed, had been impaired by a generation of intermittent hardship. The disease arrived in two forms, and both were unlike anything in London's medical experience. The first form, the bubonic plague, was spread by the bite of infected fleas. It began with fever and sudden exhaustion, the kind that drops a person mid-task. Then the lymph nodes began to swell, in the groin, in the armpits, at the neck, forming the hard, acutely painful masses that medieval physicians called buboes. These could grow to the size of a hen's egg within 48 hours. The skin around them darkened. If the swellings burst by the fourth or fifth day, the patient sometimes recovered. Most of the time, they did not. Contemporary accounts from across Europe consistently describe a death rate among those infected of between 50 and 70%, with death typically arriving within 5 to 7 days of the first symptoms. The second form was more efficient and more terrifying. Pneumonic plague traveled not by flea but by the breath of the infected. A single cough in a crowded space was sufficient. This form killed faster, usually within 3 days, and its mortality rate in untreated populations was effectively absolute. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani, who died of plague himself in 1348, before he could finish the sentence he was writing, recorded that in the great cities of Italy, the dead were being counted in thousands per week. The monk Henry Knighton, writing from Leicester in England, would later describe scenes of empty villages and unburied bodies, fields standing unharvested because the people who would have harvested them were gone. In London, the mechanisms of response were overwhelmed within weeks. The city had 14 hospitals and 2 great monastery infirmaries, together capable of caring for perhaps a few hundred sick at any given time. The plague was generating thousands of new cases every week. The parishes that normally organized burial had 12 or 14 men responsible for the dead of their community. They were losing dozens each day. Archbishop John de Stratford had died in 1348, and his successor, John de Ufford, died of plague in May 1349, before he could even be consecrated. The leadership structures of the Church, the primary institution responsible for both spiritual comfort and practical charity, were collapsing as fast as they could be rebuilt, because the clergy who administered last rites to the dying were themselves dying at rates historians now estimate at 40% or higher. The city established emergency burial grounds. East Smithfield, just outside the eastern walls, was consecrated as a plague cemetery in the autumn of 1348 by the Bishop of London, Ralph Stratford, who purchased the land specifically for this purpose. The monk Thomas Walsingham later recorded that the bishop intended the ground to receive the overflow that the city's parish churchyards could no longer accommodate. Archaeological excavations at East Smithfield, carried out by the Museum of London in the 1980s, confirmed what the chronicles describe. Thousands of individuals were interred there in ordered individual graves, not mass burials, but organized rows, maintained with whatever dignity the surviving gravediggers could manage under conditions of extreme psychological and physical pressure. The presence of those ordered rows tells us something important about the people who dug them. Even in the worst weeks of the epidemic, someone was still trying to bury the dead properly. By the spring of 1349, the plague had burned through London and was moving north. It reached Yorkshire by summer, Scotland by the following year. When it finally subsided in England by the end of 1349, though not before returning in subsequent outbreaks in 1361, 1369, 1374, and at intervals for the next 3 centuries, the accounting was devastating. London's population had fallen from approximately 70,000 to somewhere between 35 and 45,000, with the uncertainty reflecting the difficulty of counting the dead in a city where record-keeping had itself been disrupted by mortality. Some streets had lost every resident. Entire trades had lost so many practitioners that the guilds that regulated them could barely function. The ships still came to the Thames, but there were fewer merchants to meet them at Billingsgate. William Harpur had not lived to see any of it. He disappears from the records after 1319. But imagine for a moment that a son or a nephew had inherited his trade and his stall on Cheapside. That imagined young man, let us call him Edmund, as the chronicles of 1348 are full of that name, would have watched the autumn of 1348 with the particular dread of someone who had heard stories about the famine and understood, on some level, that catastrophe was a real category of event, and not merely a biblical metaphor. Edmund would have watched his neighbors sicken. He would have watched the parish priest of St. Mary Le Bow administer last rites in October and be dead himself by November. He would have watched the market on Cheapside thin, the stalls close one by one, the street that had buzzed with 1,000 voices go quiet, in ways that the worst winter had never made it quiet. And if Edmund survived, and some did, perhaps a third of those infected, perhaps a few who never caught it at all, he would have woken up in the spring of 1350 into a world that had been rearranged at its foundations. The first thing he would have noticed was the price of labor. Before the plague, a skilled craftsman in London might expect to earn 4 or 5 pence per day. By 1351, wages had roughly doubled, and in some trades they had tripled. The reason was elementary. There were half as many workers as there had been 2 years before, but the work that needed doing had not halved proportionally. Fields still needed plowing, houses still needed building, wool still needed sorting and baling for export. The people who could do these things suddenly had negotiating power that they had never possessed before, in a society built on the assumption that labor was abundant and workers were replaceable. Edmund, if he had survived and kept his trade connections, would have found that the workers he hired to move his wool bales expected wages his father would have found laughable. The landlords who owned the buildings of Cheapside were equally disrupted. With so many tenants dead and so many properties vacant, rents fell. In some cases, they fell dramatically. A city that had been running at near capacity for 2 generations suddenly had empty houses and empty warehouses, and the people who owned those properties had to compete for the tenants who remained. The economic logic of the medieval urban world, which had always favored property owners over workers, was temporarily inverted. The church, which had provided the ideological framework for that medieval world, teaching that social hierarchy was divinely ordained, that a man's station in life was God's will and not a fact to be questioned, found its authority under a pressure it could not withstand by Scripture alone. 40% of England's clergy had died. Their replacements were often poorly trained, hastily ordained men who could not provide the pastoral care or the intellectual authority that established priests had offered. Worse, from the Church's perspective, was the question that the plague itself posed. The theology of the time taught that God was all-powerful, all-knowing, and essentially just. The Black Death was not a just event. It killed the holy and the sinful with equal indifference. It killed children. It killed the archbishop. If prayer could not stop it, if the sacraments offered no protection, if dying well and dying badly produced the same result, then what exactly was the Church selling? These questions did not produce immediate revolution, but they produced a generation of people who were less automatically deferential, less willing to accept that suffering was simply God's will and their job was to endure it. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when common men and women marched on London and briefly occupied the city, demanding the abolition of serfdom and the right to sell their labor freely, drew its energy directly from the world the plague had created. The leader, Wat Tyler, was stabbed to death by London's mayor at Smithfield, within sight of the fields where the plague victims of 1348 lay buried. The revolt failed in its immediate political goals, but the idea it expressed, that ordinary people had rights that the powerful were obligated to respect, had been made thinkable by the plague. Before 1348, that idea had been, for most people, literally unimaginable. London rebuilt. It always rebuilt. The empty houses on Cheapside filled with new migrants from the countryside, drawn by the wages and the relative freedom of urban life. The wool trade resumed, though the production chain had been disrupted by the loss of so many sheep farmers and wool sorters. The guild halls that had fallen silent reopened. St. Paul's continued to host its daily crowd of merchants and worshippers and idlers. By the early 1400s, London's population was growing again, slowly but steadily, fed by the migration that catastrophe had ironically encouraged by making city life more economically rewarding for those who arrived. The city that emerged from the plague years was not the city that had entered them. It was smaller, yes, and it would not recover its 1300 population until the early 16th century. But in its social texture, its economic relationships, its implicit assumptions about who owed what to whom, it was a different place. The rigid hierarchy in which a man born to a certain station lived and died in that station was not gone. It would persist for centuries in various forms, but it had been made demonstrably contingent, demonstrably negotiable, in a way it had not been before October 1348. We live in a world that was shaped by these events more directly than most people realize. The labor rights that workers in wealthy countries now take for granted, minimum wages, the right to negotiate, the idea that an employer cannot simply command unlimited work for whatever wage the employer chooses to pay, have a genealogy that runs, through many subsequent struggles and revolutions, back to the moment when the Black Death halved the labor pool of medieval Europe, and workers discovered, by grim accident, that scarcity gives you leverage. The weakening of automatic deference to institutional religious authority, which produced the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, and the subsequent history of religious pluralism, runs partly through the crisis of confidence that the plague inflicted on the medieval church. The very concept of public health, the idea that governments have an obligation to prevent mass death from infectious disease, that sanitation is a political responsibility and not merely a private virtue, begins to take institutional form in the Italian city-states immediately after 1348, as the survivors tried to create mechanisms that might prevent the catastrophe from repeating. None of this makes the Black Death good. The suffering it caused was real and enormous, and largely fell on people who had no power to protect themselves from it. But history is not a story of pure tragedy or pure progress. It is a story of transformation, in which the same event that destroys one world creates the conditions for another. London in 1300 was a magnificent, vital, hierarchical city that believed it had found a stable form for human civilization. London in 1350 was a city that had lost 30,000 of its people and discovered, in their absence, that stability had always been an illusion and that the world was more changeable than anyone had wanted to admit. Edmund, our imagined merchant's son, picking his way through a quieter Cheapside in the spring of 1350, did not know any of this yet. He knew only that he had survived, that the bread was cheaper than it had been in October, that the stall next to his was empty, and that somewhere to the north, under a field near Smithfield that had been ordinary farmland 2 years before, thousands of his neighbors were at rest, in orderly rows, buried with whatever dignity the living could manage. That field is now a park. People walk their dogs there on Sunday mornings. The city built on top of those 30,000 lives hums and roars and shoves in every direction, completely convinced of its own permanence. It always is.